Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second of 12 webinars that will make up our 2021 Minnesota TZD webinar series. I'm really excited you've joined us today. Today, Minnesota Walks Safer Together will explore how we are striving to improve pedestrian accessibility while also reducing pedestrian safety risk. My name is Brian Sorensen. I'm one of Minnesota's 3 TZD program co-chairs and the state traffic engineer at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. I hope you had a chance to join us yesterday for our kickoff webinar, Crash and Learn, an inside look at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, as Dr. David Harkey gave us some insight into the latest vehicle safety work of the IIHS in reducing life-changing crashes on our roadways. You can find the list of all topics and speakers for our webinar series on the TZD website, minnesotatzd.org. And you can watch videos of our sessions if you aren't able to catch them live. We do hope you can attend as many webinars as possible. There's a ton of great information being shared, and once again this year, it is all free. First, we want to take a moment to thank all the individuals who helped put this webinar series together. A huge thank you to all of the session organizers, e-leaders, speakers, moderators, and the countless difference makers behind the scenes that allow us to put these sessions together and bring them to you. I want to express a special thank you to our friends at Do Good Events and the University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies, who have once again this year led the development of this webinar series and had to do so in fairly short order. Thank you for your partnership and for your dedication to Minnesota TZD. I'd also like to recognize the webinar series is offered by the Minnesota Towards Zero Deaths program and the Minnesota Departments of Health, Public Safety, and Transportation, with funding from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. A giant thank you to our loyal and generous sponsors for this year's webinar series, Bolton & Menk, AAA Minnesota Iowa, the Auto Club Group, HDR, Highway Credit Union, and the Minnesota Prevention Alliance. Thank you for supporting traffic safety and the TZD program in Minnesota. Before we start the official webinar topic, the TZD program is excited to recognize the recipient of the 2021 Child Passenger Safety TZD Star Award, Bridget Nez. This award is given to Bridget in recognition of her efforts to provide car seats and child passenger safety education for the Lower Sioux Indian community in Southwest Minnesota. This community has a high need for car seats, as well as for child passenger safety technicians. As a family advocate for the Lower Sioux Early Head Start program, Bridget has been a strong advocate for growth in these areas, working with families in need to get them car seats and collaborating with local agencies to train technicians. She also has been essential in ensuring families feel comfortable asking for services. Bridget, congratulations on your well-earned award. Would you like to say a few words?
Yes, hello guys. I just want to say that I am very honored to receive this award. I take great pride in my role as a family advocate and a child passenger safety technician. I have helped so many families in our community with car seats and education about child passenger safety that a lot of people don't know or that they haven't heard about. I am very humbled to be a part of all children's safety and just let everybody know the important information that is out there. Thank you all again.
Thanks, Bridget. A heartfelt thank you from everyone at Minnesota TZD for all that you do to improve safety in southwestern Minnesota. Over the past 10 years, we've seen an alarming trend of increased pedestrian fatalities across the country, and Minnesota is not immune to this trend. From 2008 to 2019, the percentage of non-motorists involved in traffic fatalities in our state doubled from 8% to 16%. We're also well aware of the increase in fatalities over the past year and a half. Overall, fatal crashes in 2021 through the end of September are up 25% compared to the average of 2017 to 2019 as shown here. You can see a number of factors that are directly involved with this increase in fatal crashes, including work zones, speeding, and unbelted passengers, but an increase in non-motorized fatal crashes has played a role as well. Non-motorized fatal crashes in 2021 compared to the 2017 to 2019 average are up 21%. Thankfully, we have 3 speakers lined up today to help shed some light both on what we are currently doing and where we can do more in Minnesota to reverse this alarming trend. We'll learn more about life-changing pedestrian crashes we've experienced across the state and the underlying systemic and environmental risk factors that are contributing to those crashes. We'll also hear about how Minnesota Walks, a collaborative effort between the Departments of Transportation and Health, provides a shared vision for how all Minnesotans can have safe, desirable, and convenient places to walk across the state. And we'll get an update on some work that's happening on our Native American reservations to help address non-motorized crashes. To help us through all of this morning, we are grateful to have Renee Keel from SRF Consulting Group to moderate the session. Renee did a lot of work to help us plan for in-person engineering sessions this year. And then of course she had to help us adjust on the fly to our webinar series. So a special thank you to Renee for that. And I should also note, and many may remember, that Renee is a TZD award winner from 2019 as well. So thank you for all of your efforts, Renee. Thank you for moderating today, and I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Brian, for the introduction. Like Brian said, I'm Renee Keel. I'm with SRF Consulting Group. I'm a traffic safety engineer here. For those of you that joined us late, I'd like to welcome you again to today's webinar, Minnesota Walk Safe Together. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today, but first we have to do a few housekeeping items. So if you have any questions along the way, we ask that you use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There is a chat button, but we would prefer that you use the Q&A button for any questions. You can also ask for technical help through the Q&A box, and we will get to your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. However, I will be monitoring them while the presentations are active, so if there's anything that needs to be addressed immediately, I can interrupt and ask those questions. The TZD program will be offering continuing education credits. The TZD webinar is proud to offer continuing education credits. These credits are available for this webinar. To find the forms, please go to the TZD website noted here at the bottom of your screen. For our law enforcement viewers, post-board credits are also available for this webinar. Please read this important announcement from the post board. Whether you're watching this webinar live or recorded, please watch the webinar in its entirety and follow the instructions to the TZD website. The link to this website will be in the chat box. The University of Minnesota will submit your completed affidavit of attendance report to your post board for you. So let's get to our presentations. We have 3 speakers today. First is Sonia Piper. She is a pedestrian and bicycle safety engineer at MnDOT's Office of Traffic Engineering. Her role involves working with MnDOT project managers and local partners to find ways to make Minnesota a safer place for people to walk and bike along and bicycling on state highways. Jessica Schooner is a data science practice lead at Tool Design. Her career is centered at the nexus of transportation planning and data science. In her current role, she translates original research and cutting-edge studies into actionable outcomes and interactive data collective tools for her clients. She uses GIS and statistics to help federal, state, and regional partners answer critical questions about the effects of infrastructure and the built environment on travel behavior, physical activity, health, and safety outcomes. And our last presenter is Jake Reuter. He is a pedestrian and bicycle planner in MnDOT's Office of Transit and Active Transportation. His work at MnDOT focuses on statewide pedestrian and bicycle planning, primarily in Greater Minnesota. Jake earned his Master's of Urban Planning and Policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago, with a focus on land use and transportation planning. He and his wife live in the Hamlin Midway neighborhood of St. Paul, where they care for their miniature Bernedoodle, vegetable gardens, and a small flock of urban chickens. Jessica, I'll hand it over to you to start your presentation.
Thanks, and I'm immediately going to pass it to Sonia to get us started.
All right.
Yep, just working through some of those technical difficulties. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for having us here. Good morning. And thanks to everyone that has joined us to listen in. As Renee mentioned, my name is Sonia Piper, and I changed my title recently, but I forgot to tell Renee, and I just did it just to be more inclusive. So I'm calling myself now the Active Transportation Safety Engineer, and I do work with MnDOT. So as we're here today because pedestrian safety is a serious issue in Minnesota and across the nation. Crashes and factors leading to a crash can be complex. So MnDOT initiated a contract with Tool Design Group to take a deeper look into pedestrian crashes statewide to help us better understand the roadway and contextual factors that contribute to these crashes. And Jessica Schoner from Tool Design Group is the project manager for this study, and I'm going to let her introduce herself real quick.
Thanks, Sonia. Renee already gave me plenty of an introduction, but it's been really a joy getting to work on this study with you and help tease out common factors for pedestrian crashes.
All right. So we wanted to conduct a pedestrian crash analysis that didn't require an individual to review thousands of crash narratives. We've seen firsthand how that can have negative impacts on the reviewer's mental health. And so we partnered with Tool Design to help us with this analysis and to understand the data that we have and the data that we don't. And so in this presentation, we'll highlight the process that we use to review and analyze the pedestrian crashes, how we leverage data to inform some of the contextual elements that are otherwise manual inputs, identify some data challenges, such as many different data owners and sources, and frequently that are missing that joining factor to produce that richer data set that would give us an even more complete picture and context surrounding pedestrian crashes. And once we more fully understand where pedestrian crashes occur, we can better incorporate systemic safety countermeasures. So we'll walk through a couple of tools and analysis results via crash trees to help us with that identification. And then finally, we'll cover some of the next steps, which includes ways that this information can be leveraged and implemented and additional data to collect. And then after as Renee mentioned, after we've shared through this process and our results, then Jake Reuter from MnDOT will also share an update on the Statewide Pedestrian System Plan and some of the other things that are happening within our agency. All right, next slide. So as you probably know, pedestrian fatalities and crashes on our roadways have been increasing in recent years. And if we understand what's contributing to the outcomes, we can do our best to prevent them from happening. So this study was initiated to help us better understand pedestrian safety from a systemic approach, looking at crash records and combining them with roadway and land use contextual factors. This provides us with the information that can be used in the future to adjust policies or programs, guide future data collection efforts, and inform how MnDOT selects and applies countermeasures to improve pedestrian safety. To provide this framework, we merged several data sources together to provide the rich contextual picture of the factors involved in those crashes. The goal was to conduct that safety focusing on crash review that didn't require reading the crash narrative. Studies have shown that crash narratives, especially those pedestrian-related crashes, are often biased, incomplete, and have limited applicability to proactively prevent future crashes along our roadways. Go ahead to the next slide. So for those of you familiar with the Safe Systems approach, this is what we're anchoring our analysis in. We're focusing on the roadway risk factors that could lead to systemic safety improvements. This helps us by refocusing the safety analysis with practical approaches. It focuses on underlying assumptions and realities, including that human bodies are fragile and people make mistakes, but that those mistakes shouldn't lead to death and serious injury. Deaths on our roadway are not inevitable, they are unacceptable. And by understanding the factors that contribute to crashes and their outcomes, and implementing redundant layers of safety countermeasures, we can reduce both the incidence of crashes and the severity of crash outcomes when they do occur. The ways in which we design our roadways have a direct influence on the behavior of those that use them. Why don't you go ahead? Yeah. Since pedestrians are the most vulnerable users on our roadway system, we focused on pedestrian versus vehicle type crashes. So we understand that some pedestrian related crashes may be underreported since we rely on police reports for our crash data set. And while this may be underreported from a total crash perspective, hopefully the life-altering crashes are a little bit closer. In the future, we may take a look at bicycle crashes or maybe even some other combinations. Our goal was to analyze the crash reports against roadway attributes and land use characteristics to more fully understand the crash occurrence. So as I alluded to in the previous slide, there are some known issues pertaining to the crash data that we do have. There's underreporting, there's inconsistency of reporting the low severity crashes, some are missing critical data, and there's often a survivor bias. We've also focused our analysis on crashes that have occurred between 2016 and 2019, and then we did some work to spatially join the roadway and contextual data to our crash data so that we can better understand those crash dynamics. Go ahead to the next one. So as I mentioned, we've analyzed those 4 years worth of data from 16 to 19. And while we typically would prefer 5 years, we had to work through some data limitations. In 15 and 16, the crash reporting process was overhauled, and the project was initiated in 2020 and therefore would have used an incomplete year of data. So we're limited to this. In that table, you can see there's some minor decreases in fatal and serious injury type crashes and see an overall year-to-year slight decline. But let's not get too comfortable with that. There still are too many, and we're not seeing a significant decline. So we can better understand some of the issues and what's happening when we pool the data across the years and look at roadway conditions too. So this data, or this table, shows a high-level overview of the types of data joined to the crashes for the analysis. And as you can see, the list includes roadway data such as the number of lanes, traffic volumes, functional classification, etc. It shows the MnDOT monitored roadway assets such as pavement markings, traffic signals, and signs, some ADA sidewalk and curb ramp details, some vendor data to help identify traveling speeds, destinations, and other features, and some equity and latent demand factors. While this looks like an excellent and comprehensive list of data available and used, each set comes with its own unique set of strengths and limitations. Most of the data available is specific to MnDOT interests and not representative of county or city interest. In short, we track the things we care about and we care about the things we maintain. I mentioned equity data, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about what that is. We've given it the nickname of SPACE. The factors included in SPACE are relevant due to its unique applicability for pedestrian needs assessments. Why don't you go ahead to the next slide?
Before I do, I want to jump in and just mention it's really important to understand that one of the key challenges that we're working through in this study is that most of these data sets have coverage only for MnDOT trunk highways, and we're trying to get a statewide picture of pedestrian safety. So there are certain attributes that we would love to have more information on, but we end up with really small sample size issues. So this is a challenge that we worked through in the study, and also you'll see this come back to life in some of our recommendations for future analysis and future data work.
Yep, good. I'm glad you brought that up. All right, so SPACE, we just talked about, we introduced that a second ago. So Jessica, if you mind pressing the next button one more time. SPACE is an acronym that stands for the suitability of the pedestrian and cyclist environment. It provides us with a way that to better understand the latent demand for walking and biking infrastructure within a given region. And we've been using this score as a screening tool for the past 4 years to aid with some of MnDOT's non-motorized scoping work. The concept of using data to tell a story, such as SPACE, has been also used for several other MnDOT plans. And recently, we correlated it as a systemic crash risk factor for non-motorists. And because of this, we've included it in this analysis too. So we don't have time to go into the deep dive of the SPACE tool and how we use it and what goes into it, but we'll talk high level about it. And feel free to follow up with me if you have any additional questions about it later. Generally, the SPACE score is generated from public data that focuses on priority populations, environmental justice, in existing and latent demand factors, as well as trip generators. There is one element in the score that's based on roadway context, and that's that risk factor that you see on the bottom left. That risk factor is pulled from MnDOT's district safety plans, and that identifies specific intersection elements present and statistically significant of non-motorized fatal and serious injury crashes. I'm going to go ahead to the next one. So once we identified the data elements to help us tell that story and identify those latent demand factors for walking and biking infrastructure, we had to find a way to aggregate it and use it. So for this step, we used a standardized grid of hexagons across the state. Each hexagon is a 1/2 mile in diameter, so it's that 1/4 mile on that short side. And in case you're having a tough time visualizing the size of each hexagon, it's about the size of the Mall of America. So Jessica, I believe you got to press the next button one more time. There it is. So that data from the previous slide was distributed into each hexagon as a weighted average. And that gives us a smaller granular way to view the results. All right, go ahead to the next one. This is an example of the output from the space tool in that Bemidji area of northern Minnesota. It's an area of the state where there's a significant Native American population also. So when we first started using this tool, I was conducting some non-motorized scoping work in a town called Bena. And from the perspective of a trunk highway, state highway, Bena looks like an intersection. And it didn't really seem like an area that had a high need for pedestrian and cycling infrastructure. However, because the space score was so high, we made a point to visit the future project. And while we were there, we saw a significant number of people walking along the highway in the shoulder and in the grass. So this really underscored the need for better facilities in this area, and that the space tool really is helping us to identify those areas of non-motorized infrastructure need, latent demand. You want to go to the next one? And I'm going to pass it to Jessica.
Awesome. Thank you, Sonia. So I'm excited to share with everyone some results from our analysis, and we've broken this into 2 sections. The first one is descriptive analysis, where we're looking at summary statistics of the patterns we saw in the data, and the second half is about a crash tree analysis. I'll get a little deeper into the methodology when we get to it. One thing, there are, in a few places, we go back and forth a little bit between what we're defining as a severe or non-severe crash. Pedestrian and bicyclist crashes are statistically rare. They're far too common, but in a mathematical sense, when you analyze things with really small numbers, it gets a lot harder to tease out signal from noise. And so for some of the analyses we did, we grouped together fatal and serious injury or injury A crashes. And for some of the analysis, we needed to boost our sample size a little bit. And so we also pulled in minor injury or injury B. And I know we want to focus on these life-altering crashes. That's the goal of TZD, Vision Zero, and really all of us, I think. But there is some research to show that miscategorization between injury A and injury B is fairly common, and also that there are factors associated with whether a crash results in a severe injury or a minor injury that are just like completely exogenous to the crash itself. Like obviously, motor vehicle speed and other, angle of impact can affect that, but also things like the victim's age or other health fragility. So I think that decision is defensible. It's done in other research, but I just wanted to call attention to it. We've tried to be fairly consistent with color coding, but if you see us jumping back and forth in a few places, that's why. I also want to make sure, we're up to date on our statistics 101 before we get too far into things. We're looking at factors that are associated with pedestrian risk. Okay, risk broadly defined as just crash outcomes. There are a lot of things that are correlated with crash outcomes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship is causal. So we can think about this as different avenues through which risk, the factor is associated with crashes. So it might be something that's linked to the likelihood of a crash actually happening or not. So conflicting movements. Think of someone crossing the street at an unsignalized intersection with an unmarked crosswalk, and the motorists are supposed to yield. We've got a conflicting movement that could be associated with a crash. Think about factors associated with the risk of the outcome being severe if a crash happens. So that might be something like motor vehicle speed. And then also just a risk factor for crashes occurring is where there are people walking and where those people are walking near where people are driving. Volumes and exposure to traffic are risk factors. And that doesn't mean that we would fix pedestrian safety by stopping everyone from walking. That's not the goal. But it does mean that if you see something that, makes you raise your eyebrow a little bit, like, why are lower speed roads associated with more pedestrian crashes? It's probably because they're associated with exposure. More people walk along roads that are signed 30 miles an hour than 55 miles an hour. So, you have to think about it through multiple lenses to understand. It doesn't mean slower is more dangerous. It just means that more people are walking where it's slower. So keep this in our minds as we're going through all the results. With that caveat out of the way, let's dive in. I'll start by showing an analysis that actually MnDOT did before we started this project, looking at the space score. And they found a relationship between the space score and the prevalence of pedestrian and bicyclist crashes, the Ks and As, fatal and serious injuries. And then also a correlation with the number of roadway miles. So we see most of these K and A ped and bike crashes happening in space scores over 50. And that also, space scores over 50, those hexagons comprise only 15% of the roadway miles. So we're seeing a pretty big imbalance, that crashes are concentrated in areas with high space scores. So this is already giving us a clue that space score might be a useful screening tool for safety in addition to a screening tool for latent demand. We looked at space score in this analysis as well, and we saw similar findings, that more than half of fatal and injury, so that's injury A and B, pedestrian crashes are happening in the mid-range space score, so about 50 to 70. And it's following, a similar kind of bell curve as we saw in MnDOT's previous analysis. We did see that at the lowest end of the spectrum, so the really low space scores, that the percent of crashes that happen that result in death or serious injury is higher, but that there are so many more crashes happening in the mid and higher range space score that you could probably get better bang for your buck by targeting your safety improvements in these mid to high, mainly mid-range space score areas where it's got some suitability for walking, it's got a demonstrated need for walking, but maybe doesn't have the infrastructure, the supportive infrastructure in place to help make that safe and comfortable. That was an important finding we felt. Using the space score data as well, so it's normalized by these half-mile hexagons across the state, we also looked at some demographic factors, and we found that pedestrian crashes and severe and injury pedestrian crashes are highly overrepresented in areas with high poverty rates and in areas with a lot of residents of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we saw this predominantly in the Twin Cities metro. I think just because it's such a large area and so concentrated, but some of these patterns held elsewhere as well. So equity is really important for pedestrian safety, and this is borne out in research nationwide. We're finding consistent things in a regional, Twin Cities regional pedestrian safety study we're doing. So this is not surprising, but it's telling us that this is really, really important in our work. You'll hear a lot more about MnDOT's work with pedestrian access and pedestrian safety on reservations, but we did find that when pedestrian crashes are reported on reservations, they tend to be a lot more severe than other crashes, than crashes in other locations. So again, we're seeing this pattern that that equity is deeply important for pedestrian safety. You really can't separate the two. We looked at different types of locations where crashes occur and the distribution of crashes, including how severe they are. So we've got signalized intersections without a signal. So they might be a four-way stop. They might just be a partial stop with an uncontrolled arterial going through. Intersections where we have incomplete data about what the control type might be, and kind of mid-block segments not at an intersection. And we find most crashes are happening at intersections. That's not new or unexpected. And we also see that a lot of crashes are happening at intersections with and without signals. So, this makes a lot of sense. We spend people's whole lives telling them to cross at the intersection, and so they do. And they're still getting hurt there. So, but thinking about crashes in this way, by thinking about the types of places that crashes are happening, can help us later on match countermeasures to the types of crashes and types of locations that we're working with. So this will come back when we do our crash tree analysis. We looked at crashes by functional class. We joined a lot of different roadway attributes to the crashes, but most of the roadway attributes that we had data for, we only had coverage of trunk highways. And so that represents a small portion of the system. We'll see on the next slide. Functional class is a way of looking at roads based on what purpose they're intended to serve, and they correlate to some extent with the design that you might see on these different kinds of roads. And so this is something that we have statewide that we're able to look at. And we found that more than half of pedestrian fatal and injury crashes are happening on minor arterials, even though those comprise only 7% of Minnesota's roadway network. So it's a pretty big disparity. And looking at that a different way, the rate of pedestrian fatal or injury crashes per 100 miles is 14 on minor arterials, you know, and it's like 0.5 for a local road. So it's 28 times larger. This is important because in the absence of better roadway data, you can just pull out a map, pull out a GIS layer and say, where are my minor arterials? Okay, let's go screen all of those for pedestrian safety concerns. It seems to be that minor arterials are the sweet spot between a lot of people driving on them, a lot of people walking on them. There's destinations, there's access. They're not so fast that they're terrifying for people walking, but they're fast enough to be dangerous. So they're worthy of a closer look. I mentioned MnDOT trunk highways. So these are the roads that MnDOT operates or owns, and they are, you know, they range from everything from the freeways and interstates down to the small town main street where the state highway goes through a town and the speed limit drops to 35 and there's a, you know, business frontage along the road, this whole, to even urban arterials like central entrance to Duluth or Snelling and St. Paul. So all of these are MnDOT trunk highways. They tend to be higher volume, higher speed roads than the network at large. So we're not talking local streets, but we find that there's a relatively smaller share of crashes happening on trunk highways than the rest of the network because they're just a smaller portion of the network, but the rate of crashes per mile is quite a bit higher. It's twice as high as the rest of the network. So this is really telling us that, you know, you may think trunk highways are a place that pedestrians aren't walking because, you know, it's a highway, right? Who walks on a highway? Well, a lot of people do actually, because these highways cover such important parts of our communities. Okay, now we're going to get into the next phase of our analysis where we're looking at a crash typology and crash trees. So we took a location and movement method for classifying pedestrian crashes by type, and we adapted a little bit to fit our data and our needs. So we're looking at the if there's a pedestrian involved in the crash, and then what the location was. So was it a signalized intersection? Was it mid-block? Was it an unsignalized location? And then what were the movements of the people involved in the crash doing before that crash happened? Was the motorist going straight, or were they turning? Was the pedestrian crossing the street or walking along? And so combining these attributes gets us our crash type. And there are maybe 20 or 30 different types present in the data, but there were 5 that we chose to analyze deeper. And so, you know, ranked in order by the percentage of crashes that these represent for fatal and serious injury pedestrian crashes. We've got unsignalized intersections where the motorist is going forward, signalized intersections where the motorist is going forward, non-intersection or mid-block locations where the motorist is going forward and the pedestrian is crossing the street. Those are the biggest contributors to fatal and serious injury pedestrian crashes. And then followed by that, we've got signalized intersections where the motorist is turning left and signalized intersections where the motorist is turning right. I'll point out that the crash data we're working with has the field that tells us what the pedestrian was doing leading up to the crash is a little bit ambiguous. So we're not able to reliably tease out whether the pedestrian was walking along the road or in the road for another reason. So we are able to guess when they were probably crossing, and then we can't tease out that walking along the road. So we're not analyzing that crash type. That is, you know, that is an area where MnDOT may want to look deeper, or, you know, if they want to dig into some of the narrative, the small manageable amount, like that would be the place to start, because that's something where the coded roadway data and crash data isn't telling us what we need. Notably, these three leading crash types are all involving the motorist going forward. You can think about the speeds when you're driving and you're going straight versus slowing down to turn. So that makes a lot of sense. And we also find that right turning crashes are They're not as common, and for severe crashes, they're especially not as common because they tend to be a lot slower. And that's not to say they're unimportant. We're still going to analyze them, and there are a lot of really great safety countermeasures you can use, but they are contributing a much smaller share of the fatal and serious injury crashes for pedestrians across the state. To analyze these crashes, so for each crash type, we built out what's called a crash tree. So we look at all the variables we joined to the crash data, we remove missing data, invalid data, and then we start breaking it down by different attributes within the data to just see where our crashes may be over or underrepresented, or under what combinations of circumstances are crashes happening. So we can see, this is a sample diagram. You can see here's my crash type is stop controlled intersection, motorists going forward, and then I might split it out into urban and rural and different speed groupings and other attributes. So to see that in action, here is an actual mapped out tree. So we see most of crashes of this type are happening in urban areas. We can break it out by the combinations of roadways coming together, and we see where they're clustering, and that tends to be minor arterial or major collector meeting up with a local road. So that is probably a two-way stop, partially uncontrolled intersection. So the pedestrian is crossing the uncontrolled leg of the intersection. They tend to be low to mid speeds, again, because I mentioned that people are more likely to walk in places where the speeds are a bit more, a little more comfortable. And we see these happening both near and not near transit. So along these different urban corridors. So I'm not going to go through this tree for every single crash type. I'm going to go through our key findings for each crash type because they're a little opaque to work through. But for this first crash type, so an unsignalized intersection, possibly stop controlled, partially stop controlled, or something else with the motorist going forward, we found that this represents 24% of all pedestrian fatal and serious injury crashes. So you think about, we tell pedestrians to cross at an intersection, they go to an intersection, it doesn't have a signal, and so they're waiting for motorists to yield, and maybe there's a bus coming or they have some other imminent need, they cross and they get hit. And we found that this was most common where there was different functional classes coming together with a local road. So a minor arterial, major collector, where we have some sort of like difference, a small street with low volumes and a busier street. So they're probably crossing the busier street. And these occurred in like almost all kinds of land uses. We saw them happening near transit, not near transit, near shopping, not near shopping. It's kind of hard to screen for, but it's important to think about when we're designing long corridors where there's a half-mile or longer gap in between signals. People are going to be trying to cross the street at all of those minor intersections in between. And how can we help slow those vehicles down and make those conditions safer for people crossing at the intersection? Next crash type was signalized intersections with the motorist going forward. This represented 14% of fatal and serious injury crashes. And importantly, 96% of these occurred in urban areas. So these are really important in urban areas. And over 2/3 of these are happening where the speed limits are pretty low. They're 35 or below. That doesn't necessarily mean the motorist was going 35 or below, but they're signed 35 or below. Minor arterials are involved. They're close to transit. They're close to pedestrian destinations. And so this means that if you're working on safety in an urban area, you can look for streets that meet these characteristics. Where do I have a low to moderate speed street with transit and pedestrian destinations nearby? And then think about the safety features that I'm putting in at these intersections, curb bulb outs, crossing refugees or islands. There's a lot we can do to help mitigate this kind of crash. The third most common, and we're still on this trend of motorists going forward, so higher speeds, was not at an intersection. So think a person crossing the street in the middle of a block. Maybe their destination is immediately across the street. Maybe the bus stop is mid-block and the bus is coming. But people do need to cross all along the network, not just at an intersection. And this represents 13% of all pedestrian fatal and serious injury crashes in the state. We found this was largely urban, 3/4 of the crashes were urban, but there was still 1/4 of these crashes that were happening in rural areas. So this is not exclusively urban like we saw with signalized intersections. And similar to the previous crash type, they're also happening largely on the low to mid speed roads. You know, usually 2 lanes, though it could be more. More lanes tend to have more signalized intersections and be a bit more of a deterrent. And then these, oddly enough, were not so close to transit, shopping, entertainment, or restaurants. And we think it's because the density of these destinations also usually correlates with the presence of a signal. So, but it's an important crash type to think about and to address in design. Next, we'll get into our turning movement crashes. So signalized intersection and the motorist is turning left and strikes a pedestrian. This is 9% of severe crashes in the state for pedestrians. And so again, we see minor arterials and low to mid speeds are implicated here. I'll mention again, this does not mean slow speeds are dangerous and fast speeds are safer. Absolutely not. It means that people are more likely to walk where the speeds are lower. And so we see more crashes there. But we do know time and time again from other research that if a crash occurs, the motorist's speed is hugely impactful in terms of how severe that outcome is. So more are happening on low speed roads. That doesn't mean we want to go raise the speed limits. This turning movement crash type is really common near transit and near other types of destinations. So this is something where you can look at your minor arterials, look for destinations like transit and restaurants and entertainment, and go identify how you can maybe separate your pedestrians and your left turning motorists through space or time. So, you know, protected phasing, that sort of thing. And finally, we've got motorists turning right. This was only 2% of severe crashes, but that doesn't mean it's unimportant. Any death or serious injury on our roadways is too many. And there are also pretty easy countermeasures that you can implement that can help with this crash type, like curb bulb outs or leading pedestrian intervals at your signals. That's just a simple signal retiming. So it's worth looking at because you know, because the countermeasures can be so easy. These are largely an urban phenomenon, again, with these low to mid-speed minor arterials near pedestrian destinations, shopping, entertainment, restaurants. You know, sometimes we joke, except it's not really a joke, that you find like a Dairy Queen and someone will walk there. You had better have crosswalks and pedestrian supportive facilities there because people will walk there. And we see that in the data. So I'm going to pass it back to Sonia now to talk about the takeaways.
All right, so thank you. So what we see is using the public data to identify equity and latent demand factors are really useful in understanding and identifying those safety risks. So we did talk about the SPACE tool during this presentation, and I want to point out that the Statewide Pedestrian System Plan that Jake's going to talk about also created a very similar tool using a similar process, but slightly different factors. And we call that the PAUSE tool. PAUSE stands for the Priority Areas for Walking Study. So by joining the contextual data to crashes and analyzing the crashes across the roadway system, actionable trends can be identified to guide the implementation of low-cost systemic pedestrian safety countermeasures. That proactive application of systemic safety countermeasures saves lives. For those of you that are not part of a MnDOT jurisdiction, please feel free to use the results of this analysis to guide your work, or also consider reaching out to MnDOT for more information. So we've been talking a lot about the data that we did use, and I also want to take a minute to highlight the limitations of the data and where we have gaps. So as Jessica mentioned earlier in the presentation, you know, we had done a broad scan of all the data available for this analysis, and including whether we had the data for just MnDOT highways or the whole state, and what would have been an ideal set of data for pedestrian safety analysis. So, because the reality is better data can help us do a more nuanced analysis. So the chart on the left shows the database and basically the ownership of it. The takeaway here is that there's some data points that we have comprehensively across the whole state of Minnesota, including functional classification, motor vehicle volumes, and some of our data is really only for a specific set. And we have that sporadically across the state. So basically that's just MnDOT's assets. There might be some local jurisdictions that are collecting this information, but there's not really a shared data repository that we can all go to put our information there to use it in some way in the future. And then in some cases, like crosswalk markings, we really don't have that data at all. And the text on the right there includes some information and recommendations for additional data to collect that would help us better understand pedestrian crashes, identifying those countermeasures, and prioritizing the locations for the safety treatments. And so some of that data includes operating speeds. How fast was the driver going at the time of the crash? Sidewalk, curb ramps, and those the locations where we have them, where we don't. Some traffic signals and different types of pedestrian signals amongst a handful of others. I'm gonna go to the next slide.
Well, I wanna chime in here also that like, you know, MnDOT's data, relatively speaking, is not bad. I mean, this is the landscape for pedestrian data nationwide. So this isn't, you know, like MnDOT is doing a lot of the right things, and Sonia's department is already working on data sets that can help consolidate and aggregate a lot of these data. And so we're, you know, hopefully helping by providing some insights as to which specific variables are useful for pedestrians. But I know there's already really great work with the MnDOT intersection and interchange data sets that your office is using to do additional safety analyses. Like, a lot of cool things are happening. And so this is going to be a really interesting space to watch. And I think for other agencies and you know, cities and counties listening in, like to contribute to and to share your data.
I'm glad you bring that up. I get so focused on where we can do better, but I forget to point out that we're still doing well. Yeah, appreciate that thought. Why don't you go ahead to the next slide then? So ultimately, ensuring pedestrian safety is a challenge, and especially in those complex roadway environments where we have that high pedestrian potential. But using data and through this analysis, we can understand those priority areas and appropriate countermeasures. Through analysis processes such as this, you know, we can better understand those implications of past design and how to apply those appropriate countermeasures moving forward to improve our future roadway designs. And we can also better understand where to deploy those systemic safety engineering tools and design our roadways for the outcomes that we wish to achieve, all in an effort to eliminate the pedestrian deaths on our roadways. There are a lot of resources out there for different types of countermeasures and how to create safer conditions for people walking. Some of these can be, you know, challenging to implement. Some of them are pretty, you know, self-sufficient and don't need a lot of background data to implement. But there are, I mean, the bottom line is there are resources, and some of them I'll just highlight real quick is some FHWA crash modification factors. So that's where, you know, with specific countermeasures, we can understand the types of crashes that we're trying to prevent or alleviate based on the type of countermeasure that we're trying to implement. The NACDO Urban Street Design Guide is a really good resource, especially for those areas that are the low speed that Jessica talked about, speeds lower than 35 miles an hour. FHWA Guide for Improving Pedestrian Safety at Uncontrolled Crossings. They also have a toolbox of countermeasures and their potential effectiveness for pedestrian crashes. And also there's an NCHRP report that highlights the guidance to improve pedestrian and bicyclist safety at intersections. I'm not going to go through the rest of them. Do you want to go to the next slide? Yeah.
Yeah, you can download this presentation after we're all done and come and take another look at this resource slide and go look for them yourself. I find like the appendix of this NCHRP 926 has a really beautiful matrix of different countermeasures you can implement and under what context they make the most sense. So definitely check it out after the session.
Good point. And then MnDOT has a handful of resources as well that that you can look at, and feel free to contact us if you have any questions. So that's the end of our portion of the presentation. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. And as I mentioned before, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We're going to turn it over to Jake now.
Thanks, Sonia, and thank you, Jessica. both of you for a presentation that was so rich in data and understanding what it means. And hopefully we can all take that data and put it into practice some way. So I am going to tell a little bit about our statewide pedestrian system plan, which I think it's been a 2-year-long project, and many of you have probably heard a thing or two about it along the way. So we'll talk briefly about the statewide pedestrian system plan itself before getting into some of the implementation work we're doing, and then an update on MnDOT's research on walking in tribal nations in Minnesota. So I want to start our time here together by sharing a little video, if you'll indulge me. This is a video that will help us to understand how and why people make the decision to walk where they do.
MnDOT roadways link people to Minnesota communities. We are responsible for supporting safe walking as a key mode of transportation. We have many design and policy tools to do this, but first, we must remember that we are designing for people and how they travel. In some cases, people walk mid-block across the street outside of a crosswalk, and this may irritate you. Why not cross in the crosswalk? Let's take a closer look. We're going to take a walk from the library to the bus stop. Highway 65, also known as Central Avenue, is part of the MnDOT trunk highway system. This is the shortest, most convenient path. It is the most logical route to save time. However, there are no safe crossings to get here quickly. A person walking may cross here, the shortest path, rather than go to the marked crossings that are farther away. This route shows the path someone would have to walk to get to the bus stop by using the marked crosswalks. This can be frustrating if you're just trying to get across the street to catch a bus, especially if missing the next bus means you have to wait a long time. MnDOT is changing our policies and practices to improve walking through all seasons to support how people move. We can make walking more convenient, safer, and even joyful. Investing in high priority areas helps us do just that.
All right. So yes, sometimes it can be frustrating when people don't walk exactly where we want them to, but we do need to remember the fact that people are making choices that are best for them in the moment and weighing the safety risks that they see in multiple different directions. The person who's trying to get across the street to catch the bus maybe has a need to go pick up their kid from daycare. And so that extra 3, 4, even 5 minutes that we saw in the video can really make a significant impact on their life. So situations like that are what we keep in mind when we do pedestrian planning at MnDOT. And our statewide pedestrian system plan goals included the following: promoting walking as a universal need, creating healthy and equitable communities, creating safer places to walk, creating enjoyable places to walk, and also building internal capacity to advance walking. Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the plan, but I do want to make sure that if you go look at it, you have some idea of how you can use it in your own work. The plan is by MnDOT and mostly focused on how we can improve walking on MnDOT's highway system. That being said, there are different ways that you can use the document, whether you work for MnDOT, you're a tribal liaison, you work for a different state agency, you're a part of local government, or even are a part of an advocacy group. And just to call out 2 of those, if you're a person who works for MnDOT, perhaps you can use this to help your project development action items with your day-to-day work. You can reference the pause tool that Sonia referenced earlier, which helps us to understand infrastructure needs and solutions for communities around the state, and following environmental justice strategies for advancing equity within our projects. And if you work for a partner government agency, this can be a really great reference to know what MnDOT's goals for pedestrian planning are, what the benefits of walking are, and why it's important that we work together towards these goals. And then also being familiar with the way that MnDOT's project development practices work and understanding where the key points for collaboration with MnDOT staff are. Again, the pause tool, well focused on the trunk highway system or the state highway system, can be used to help identify places around the state that might indicate a higher need for walking. So why are we doing this work at MnDOT? What's the big deal about doing a statewide pedestrian system plan? What we heard in our engagement with more than 2,000 folks around Minnesota is that 74% of people fully support investments that improve walking in their communities. And we have some ideas why that's probably the case. Improving walking delivers social, economic, environmental, and health benefits to people throughout Minnesota, whether living in a very small town or the biggest of cities. And third, MnDOT has an opportunity to lead. We're seen across the country as a leader on walking and have a reputation as such among our partner state DOTs. But we can continue to build on this reputation and deliver some of the improvements that are needed to improve safety for people who are walking along and across our state roadways. This includes not just some of the traditional ways we think about safety, like crashes and exposure, but also rectifying inequities and mitigating the impacts of climate change going forward on people who are walking. So what's next? We did this plan. It's, I think, about 140 pages, so it's a pretty thick document. And all too often, we know that documents can end up sitting on a shelf somewhere and don't get implemented in the way that we want them to. So we fortunately have funding for 3 implementation projects that are scheduled to start yet this fall. And they focus on 3 primary areas of the statewide pedestrian system plan. First being high priority pedestrian safety improvements, the second being climate mitigation for pedestrians, and the third is pedestrian and bicycle facility maintenance planning. And I'll share a little bit of information about each of these 3 projects with you so you have a taste of what we'll be working on over the next year to year and a half. The high priority pedestrian safety improvement project is tied into an investment scenario in the statewide pedestrian system plan that sought to understand what it would cost to make improvements in those highest priority areas in the state that would really impact safety outcomes. So we found in our pause analysis that the highest scoring places, the places where we expect the most people to be walking, make up about 0.2% of the land area of the state, or about 6.5% of the state's highway system. Within those locations, we found that between 2016 and 2018, about 48% of pedestrian crashes occurred in those top tier areas. And so what we're seeing there is almost half the crashes happening in either 0.2% of the state or just over 6% of the trunk highway system. The cost of those crashes, if we were to continue to experience them at the rate we do during the last 5 years, would be about $4 billion when translated to economics. And we know that no economic measure can really equate to the emotional toll that these crashes take on families and communities. When we look at the types of improvements we might make through an investment scenario like this, things like bump outs, high visibility crosswalk markings, rapid rectangular flashing beacons, the planning level cost estimate for these ranges between 210 and 206 or 650 million. And so we can think about that potential investment in our system as a way to really reduce the potential costs to our society that would occur with crashes otherwise. So how do we make this into an action? We'll be working in partnership with MnDOT's districts over the next year to year and a half to identify opportunities to make improvements like those that are recommended in the statewide pedestrian system plan over the course of the next 10 years. Some of those will be projects that can be part of a larger scale roadway project. Some of them will be quick build or demonstration projects where we put out temporary traffic control materials to make a significant change on the roadway and improve people's safety. The second project that we'll be working on is climate mitigation for pedestrians. This is tied to a climate mitigation investment scenario in the statewide pedestrian system plan and responds to the need for both attractive walking spaces and spaces that mitigate the impacts of high heat and heavy rain events. We know that those high heat and heavy rain events are increasing in frequency in Minnesota, and people walking don't have any protection from those elements. If we go back and forth between the last slide And this slide, the image on the right shows some of the differences that might occur if we go from that safety-focused improvement to a climate mitigation improvement. We've narrowed the roadway here. The roadway or the roadsides have been greened. We've got some trees that provide shade and shelter from both wind and rain. We have stormwater runoff gardens and other things that increase both the climate adaptability of the space, but also provide some of the elements of joy that were talked about in the video that we started with today. So this is a new sort of thing for MnDOT. We think about safety a lot. It's a core part of our mission and really a focus on what we do, whether we're planning for people walking, bicycling, driving, taking transit, or however they're getting around. Planning for climate mitigation is a newer thing for us. And so this project will be a little bit more exploratory and try to understand what types of investments would be most effective along our roadways. And the third and final, though not least important project that we'll be taking on in the next year to year and a half is looking at ped bike maintenance planning. Improved winter maintenance was the #1 policy recommendation from ped plan engagement responses. It's the thing people want us to do most out of anything that we could do. So we're going to do a project to explore how we can be better at delivering better winter maintenance. This will look at both summertime or seasonal maintenance like vegetation trimming, leveling and grinding, and also winter snow and ice maintenance. We're doing this planning work in partnership with Metro District to understand their current maintenance practices and also what different potential future scenarios could look like to help plan for costs and to identify who and how we can best position ourselves to make sure that this work happens and people are able to walk and bike safely through the winter time. And then I do want to share some information about our office's continued work looking into ped traffic and safety on Anishinaabe reservations. This is work that's led by Michael Pettish, and I'll give a quick overview, but if you're looking to learn more about this project, I would really suggest getting in touch with him. These photo collages that are present in the presentation, I think, are really, really impactful. This research study uses cameras to set up at intersections or other places along corridors and records over time to better understand how people are using facilities. So here we're at Big Lake Road in Fond du Lac, and we can see this collage of images is showing the different ways that people are using this space over the horizon of time that the camera has been out there. To the left on the screen, in 1 mile, we've got a high school and several government centers. To the lower left, in 1 block, there's a community center, the police department, and public health. To the right, a half mile away, we've got gas, food, and housing, and we can see people riding bikes in that direction in the photo. And then housing is to the top of the image here. So we're setting ourselves up in a situation here where we've got people coming from housing and using this facility to get to a whole bunch of key destinations in the community and connect up with the resources that they're looking to. So this is a 2-phase research project. The phase 1 report is available, and I'll post the link both to the video that I shared at the beginning of the presentation and that report in the chat box after the presentation. That includes pre and post data collection and evaluation. And phase 2 is happening now with some additional sites identified in Leech Lake, Red Lake, and White Earth. Earlier in 2020, sites were visited and discussions happened with the tribes. And then, as we all remember and are still living through, the COVID pandemic came on in March of 2020, which really put a pause on this research project. In spring of summer of this year, the team was able to resume data collection, and we're progressing on the project as such going forward. And some of the lessons learned, this is Michael in the photo on the right, the furthermost right in the photo to the right of this slide. Plans and policies matter. The way that we think about walking and make it part of our work does have an impact. That having evidence like those photo collages is essential to telling the stories of the ways that people are using space. This is something that I think connects to Sonia and Jessica's presentation. Risks are relative but real. There may not be as many people using facilities like the photo that we looked at earlier in the slides, but the risks are really high, and particularly higher in places where somebody who's driving may not expect to see a person walking based on their own experience in the world. Equity as well as efficiency is important in making sure that we get these projects out, and that early engagement with collaborators is critical to successful work. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for being part of this webinar today. I'm looking forward to discussing some questions and answers with you on the Q&A session. and look forward to connecting with you soon. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jake, for your presentation. Before we get to questions and answers, I just wanted to ask you quick if you could take a minute to fill out the evaluation survey for this session. You can find the link in the chat box. It will be emailed to you, or you can use your phone to hover over the QR code and the form will come up on your phone. The TZD leadership does read the results from this survey and uses this information for future events. So we thank you so much for filling this out. I'm going to leave the QR code on the screen here as we transition to Q&A questions. We did get quite a few questions in the Q&A box that I don't think we'll have time to get through all of them. Some of them were actually answered by text from Sonia and Jessica. So if you put a question in there, maybe check the tab at the top that says answered to see your answer. So it looks like we have about 6 questions for Jessica and Sonia and a few for Jake. So I'll start with the first one. Sonia, it looks like you're maybe typing right now, but there's one question about where we can find more literature if available on the SPACE tool and scoring criteria.
Yes, and that's a really good question. I had kind of started and let's talk about that for a second. And then also, Renee, I did something wrong with one of the answers that I think would be good to talk about. Okay. So that's one of the limitations with SPACE is that we still have some work to do to get it to a public venue. We talk about it a lot to others, and we've been talking about the SPACE tool to FHWA and many other state DOTs, because the point is we need to be looking at equity very intentionally. And that's kind of why we developed SPACE is from an equity standpoint, from a latent demand standpoint, and then found out later the proactive systemic impacts to it. And the point is, we might not, if you're afraid of doing it perfectly, you might not, the point is start, right? So that's kind of why we say it, like everybody has access to that data. None of that data is maintained by MnDOT specifically, with the exception of that risk factor. But so I need to do a better job of getting that up on our public website, but also, Jake's pause score is a really good tool also. And so if you want to refer to something specific to walking, take a look at that pause score. It's very comprehensive throughout the state too. They have slightly different factors, like I had mentioned before, but they're both really good tools. And then the other one, Renee, that I screwed up on was a question about when I mentioned the SPACE score and its relation to Bemidji. But the comment is, if you're not one of those people walking or biking, I don't think that people always see the people that are. And what is MnDOT doing to break this stereotype, as in that understanding of like, well, people aren't walking here, and are there any PSAs? And that's a really, really good question. To me, I think about it from an equity standpoint and an ADA accessibility sort of a standpoint. Do you have a way to get from here to there? There might be a lot of, farms along a rural road, but the reality is I might live there and my doctor has told me I need to go, get more exercise. Can I do that safely without needing to go to a gym that isn't available to me or whatever it is? So we kind of try to talk about it from an equity and a transportation equity and an accessibility standpoint as well. And I guarantee that there's more work that we can do. So if anyone has any great ideas, let's partner. Let's talk about that.
Okay, I'm going to go back to another question that Jessica actually answered in the chat, but it was asked twice, and so I thought maybe it was important to mention. Jessica, there was a question about our light conditions part of the crash information that you're looking at, and how does that affect what your results?
Yeah, so the standard crash report data that we work with does have information on lighting. And we had limited GIS data about lighting that we could work with, but that was not a major focus of this study because we already know from a lot of established literature that pedestrian crashes tend to be more numerous and more severe in darkness. There is an ongoing NCHRP research project right now, 1797, I believe, that is all about pedestrian fatalities in darkness. So there's a lot of work already underway, and we really wanted to focus on the other roadway risk factors. The other element of that was just data availability. So we had, MnDOT provided a data set of where there are light posts along MnDOT's assets, the trunk highway network. That tells us whether there's a light post. That does not tell us what the actual lighting condition on the ground is like. You know, I can speak to recent experience walking along the street that had, you know, it had a single light post maybe at every intersection, and that illuminates the center of the intersection. And, you know, if I weren't looking so vigilantly, I might have missed the fact that there are people like waiting to cross at the edge of the sidewalk, but they're not within where that light is aiming. So the auto-oriented lighting really isn't telling us much about what pedestrian lighting conditions really are. So we didn't think we'd get all that much looking at the data that existed from MnDOT's roadway asset system. I've also seen in reviewing crash narratives in the crash reports, you know, an officer may mention in that, like, there's a street light here, but it's still really dark. So like, we know this is a problem, and we know that the data about where light posts are is just not adequate to answer the question. So I know that's a really unsatisfying answer, but people need to walk places in darkness. And so we need to find ways to make it safe even when it's dark.
All right, thank you. I'm going to jump down to one other question that is for Jessica and Sonia. How do the space tool and pause tools overlap? MnDOT districts were trying to use an equity approach to shoulder widths to provide places for walking and biking on lower volume roads. We were not able to do this statewide. Could the tools be used as a surrogate?
Yeah, and I'll rope Jake into answering this one too. Jake, do you want to start or do you want me to?
Sure, I can start, Sonia.
Okay.
I think the cleanest way to think about this is that the pause tool doesn't think about biking at all. It's focused specifically on people walking, the destinations that they frequently visit, and the types of economic generators and land uses that we see that incur people walking in a location, along with a lot of the demographic and equity factors that are also included in the space tool. But it is very much focused in on walking and not bicycling. And that probably is a good place to hand it off back to you, Sonia, to talk about the space tool.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that as depending on what you want to look at, so yes, it can be used as a surrogate, but it's not the only measure. And I don't think that the space tool or the pause tool should be used as a sole measure to help us figure out what it is that we want to do and where. I think of it as kind of a layer in that, or a chapter in how we tell the story and how we identify what we want to do. So in the case of looking at shoulders, you know, you would also want to be comparing that to, you know, regional trails or state trails that are in the area, and the, you know, the destinations and I think that the short version and short way to answer your question is I would like for there to be a really easy answer, and it's not. And we still have to combine a lot of different things, because some of that also is looking at some of the work in the planning that our cities and counties are doing as well, and I'm aligning those. And that's not necessarily like a super easy data layer.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move to some questions for Jake for your presentation. So Jake, there's a question about, is there funding available for county highway departments to implement climate mitigation strategies along roadways?
A really good question. And it's one that we will hopefully get into a little bit as this project unfolds, knowing that first we need to understand how MnDOT can participate in this, and then we need to understand how MnDOT's participation works in relationship to our city and county partners. I think we're all trying to understand what's potentially coming in the transportation bill that's in the federal government right now, and the potential follow-up reconciliation bill. There are some measures in there that do move towards climate mitigation on the transportation system, including potentially tree canopy development, particularly in places that already experience high heat stress events. So it's something that the clean answer is we don't know yet, but we will be digging into over the next year to year and a half to better understand both MnDOT's role and how we can help connect folks to resources to do so.
All right, I'm down to my last minute here. So Jake, I just wanted to ask you one more question from Ken. He said, one eye-opening statistic from the statewide pedestrian system plan was a percentage of Minnesotans that can't or won't drive. He's wondering if you can remind us of what that statistic is.
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of people in Minnesota don't drive. Part of that is people who are too young to drive. Part of it is people who've given up driving as they've advanced in age. Part of it is people who aren't able to drive for any number of different reasons, and also people who don't choose to drive. And so when we are talking about safety for people walking and biking, we're not talking about a small group of folks here. This is a really significant portion of the people in our state. And as people working in public service, we have a duty to serve those folks as well as the motoring public.
Great, thank you, Jake. All right, it looks like our time is up. We have a few more questions that did not get answered, and I apologize for that. Again, there's the answer tab at the top. If there was some text answers were provided to some of your questions. We thank you for joining our session today. Please fill out this evaluation. We really appreciate your input, and be sure to look at future webinars from the TZD series to see if there's any interest in joining. Thank you for your time today.